Okay, welcome to episode 2 of Spreadsheet Tips and Tricks. In this example, we are going to use a VLOOKUP formula, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, simply put, a VLOOKUP is a way to do a lookup from a vertical list of data. And when I say vertical list, I mean the data is arranged in columns rather than in rows. So let's take a peek at what we need to do to get started here. Let's create a data set, and let's hypothetically assume we've got things like user IDs, usernames, and zip codes. So let's create some fake data. All right, so we've got some fake data in here. Now we need to put some postcodes in. Oops. All right, so we've got some hypothetical postal codes. I'm not actually sure if these are real, but for the sake of this example, it doesn't really matter. We're not sending anything. All right, so we've got some fake data here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create a lookup. So let's hypothetically assume we've got some other table that we're working out of, and we know we have a user's ID, but we don't really have their username, and we'd like to have that available. So let's create a table of corresponding data for which we might want to look things up. So just for the sake of visuals, I'm going to um, insert an arrow so we can kind of see what we're looking at here. Again, this is just for visual sake. This has no bearing on the formulas or anything. So insert an arrow there just to show that, okay, we're looking at a separate data set now. And in this data set, we're going to have perhaps some logging data. We're going to have user IDs, and we're going to have dates. All right, so just copy this data in so we can kind of see what we're doing here. Now, obviously, the data is not always going to be this well organized, so we can mix things up a little bit here. All right, so let's go ahead and clean this up. Let's sort this range by date. So now we've got this log data here, and we're thinking to ourselves, all right, we've got this information, we've got a long list of data, but we're just looking at a snapshot here for the sake of this example. But user IDs aren't really something that we can make sense of. It's not something that helps us. We don't really recognize user IDs off the top of our head. And for the purposes of this report, we really want to be able to aggregate things by username. So we're going to create a username field, and here's where the VLOOKUP comes into play. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking up the user ID value from here against this table, and what we want to do is we want to bring back the username field. So let's start the process here. We're going to start with a VLOOKUP, and the very first thing we're going to include in this is the search key. So that's going to be a reference to this cell right here. Now, the next thing that we want to do is we want to tell it what range we want to look towards. Now, I'm going to go ahead and select this entire range here, but I want to make note of something, that this is a relative reference, right? So one of the things we need to do is we want to change this to a static reference. And the reason for that is because as we move this formula down, we want this J11 relative reference to change. We want this in cell L12 to reference J12. But we do not want this range to keep moving down at the same rate. Otherwise, we'll be looking up values from a range that's like does not contain data. So by wrapping the range within these dollar signs, it creates a static reference. And so when we use the fill handle to pull the formula down, or if we were to copy and paste, those references would stay static, whereas the ones that do not have the dollar signs in front of them would be variable. So if you move the fill handle to the right, the column would increment from J to K. If you were to move the fill handle down and copy the column down, the reference would go from J11 to J12, and we'll see that here in a second. All right. Now, the next thing that can sometimes trip people up is we want to provide the index. So What is the index? Well, the index is really simply put what column number in the range that we want back. So we're always looking up from the first column, and this is something that's important to note, is we can't look up from like we can't like have the user ID in column 3 and try to get a value from column 1. It has to be the first column. But the first column is the user ID, so the index of the column that we want the results from is 2. We're going to type that in. And then the last thing is a optional field called is sorted. And this indicates whether the column to be searched is sorted, in which case the closest match is. So this is essentially the same thing in Excel, but Excel calls it something a little bit different. What we generally want to do here is provide a false value. If you provide a true value or anything else, what it's going to do is find the closest match, but that's not helpful. 99.9% of the time, you're not using a VLOOKUP to find something that's the nearest match. And if you're trying to do something like that, VLOOKUP is probably not the way to go about it. So as a general rule, my recommendation is always use false as the parameter there. And so what you can see here is this autofill suggestion is already going to give us the option. I'm going to go ahead and use Command Enter just to fill that out. But as I was mentioning a second ago, as this reference has changed, or as this formula has been copied down, the reference to the lookup cell has changed, but the reference to the range in which we're looking up the data has not. So what we've ended up here with is a VLOOKUP table. We had user IDs and dates, and we were able to look up the usernames. Now, if we wanted to take this one step further and say, hey, I want to see where these users are, we could pull in the zip code value. And to do that, we can literally copy this formula. And the only thing that has to change is which column we're pulling from, because instead of column 2, now we want the third column. Boom, simple as that. I'm going to clean that up. And one tip and trick, that's sort of a sub-trick tip, you may have noticed this as I was typing in the zip code, and I did this intentionally. Zip codes are a pain in the butt because they're 5-digit or more, depending on if you're using zip plus 4 characters, but they can start with a 0. And if you've ever worked in a spreadsheet, you'll know that a 0 is just a throwaway character as a leading digit, right? Because like 0,001 is one, like 0,1001 is just 1001. There's no like place in math for a leading 0 like that. However, zip codes are not mathematical representations, but they're zone IDs, and so nobody really thought about spreadsheets in that context. So what you have to think about is there's 2 ways to go about this. One, you can either format the column as text and then paste it in from a plain text source, but an easier way to go about it is to just preface the cell with a single quotation mark. And what this does is it tells your spreadsheet program, whether it's Google Sheets or Excel, don't like treat this as a number, don't treat this as anything other than literally what I type in after the single quotation mark. So we can also use that when we're looking at dates, right? You may have run into a problem before where you have a date that's formatted and you're like, no, I really want it to show up in a specific way. Well, if you lead that with a single quotation mark, you get the same opportunity. And you'll notice that it's like offset to the left there. That's indicating that it's now being formatted as plain text, not being formatted as a date, which is why I was going through and aligning everything to the right, just as a matter of like visual aesthetic. When you copy and paste this out, though, something to make note of is that those single quotes don't go with it. So you don't have to worry about taking them out. It's really something that's just there to tell the spreadsheet application, stop, do not parse this as you normally would. This is a value that I want to literally appear as I type everything after the single quote.